to admit I'm an LTUE newbie, but I'm no stranger to dragons. I've loved dragons since I was very small, and I think my first memory of reading a dragon book was in 3rd grade. My sister had just read Dragon Song by Anne McCaffrey. She was a 5th grader, and we were so new to this idea of loving books that she started reading it onto a tape so that we'd always have it because she had to return to the library at some point. And so I fell in love with dragons when I was about 8 and have never given that up. Throughout a PhD study and an academic career that doesn't necessarily always look as kindly on dragons as it ought, I think. So this was a real treat for me to get to dive into this. And one of the reasons I chose to come to BYU, I've been here about a semester and a half. I was in Wisconsin for 10 years at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, teaching in Scandinavian studies, which has great dragons. We'll talk about some great Scandinavian dragons here in a minute. But one of the things I liked about the chance to come here was the chance to do more with this kind of thing. So I'm actually teaching a class in spring term on dragons, a literary typology of dragons, which is I think how I got this invitation to talk today. So any feedback you can give me that I can then turn into my class will be enormously helpful. Because I don't think it's just enough to just love dragons. I think for me as a scholar, as a reader, as a thinker, I need to understand why I love dragons, why we have dragons, since as far as I can tell, they don't actually exist. It's really interesting that we have spent so much time and so much paper and ink writing them into existence again and again and again, culture after culture after culture. And it's not as if there's a single standard dragon or a single standard narrative about dragons. They're wildly different narratives across time and across space. And so the question I want to explore today is why we're so fascinated by dragons, what it is about the dragons themselves that we fear, that we admire, that we envy, and what it is about dragons that we see in ourselves. And so the presentation title, The Dragon in the Mirror, is really about this interplay, because I really feel like the reason we spend so much time on dragons is because we try to help them understand, they help us understand ourselves and our own world. And so if you think about literature, one of the main functions of literature is to conceptualize the world differently than it is, to hypothesize what the world would be like if things were different than they are. And so when you write literature and you use dragons, you can't just pop in a dragon and stick it down and say, dragon equals X. The dragons that last, and there are so many dragons, I couldn't talk about all of them, but the dragons that we talk about today, I think, are dragons that have made a difference. And it's largely because they mean something. They mean something more than themselves. And so we're going to try and track today a little bit how dragons have been perceived in different cultures and different times, and how they've changed to today in trying to understand this hypothetical function of literature. What if there were dragons? What if there were dragons now? If there were dragons here? If there were dragons in Napoleonic England? If we settled other planets and invented dragons, what would that mean? What would that mean for us and the way we relate to dragons, but also to ourselves? And I think what we'll find is that we're really always talking about the dragon in the mirror. So if you look at early European texts about dragons, they're almost always greedy, vicious enemies to be hunted and feared and killed. But if you look at contemporary science fiction fantasy, those are not the dragons that we love. I think very few of us are thinking of the dragon in Revelations when we think about the dragons that we admire. I think Anne McCaffrey's Dragonflight from 1968 is a really good example of this very different paradigm of dragons. Dragons that we can relate to, dragons that we want to spend our lives with, not dragons that we're finding knights to come and slaughter. And so this shift in the representation of dragons, I think, is really important and reflects a lot of shift about the way we look at humanity. The dragons that we see in contemporary science fiction fantasy still fly, they still have scales, they still have claws, and they still breathe fire, all the things that made them scary 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. They're more than that. And depending on the book, they're telepathic. I mean, they're always sentient. They're time traveling. They're articulate. They're sensitive. And they in many ways have much more in common with the Asian traditions of dragons. Chinese and Japanese dragons that are wise and venerable, than with our own European dragon, well, my genetic history of European dragons. And what we see is by the end of the 20th century, the way that dragons appear in literature is almost completely reversed from how it was in the early European period. The relationship of aggressor to victim is reversed. No longer the dragons when ravaging the landscape to be hunted down. We're the ones persecuting the dragons. We're the ones that need to learn to appreciate them, to stop attacking them, enslaving them, exploiting them for their parts. And we need to help them. And so in many ways, these new dragon texts, I think, are calls to compassion and to activism. So let's explore some of these dragons and see how we get there. So I don't know if you know this, but I don't have any idea when the first tales of dragons were told. As far as I can tell, they begin with the first stories. They've been in folklore for centuries, as I said, around the world. National mythologies have all kinds of dragons. They appear in the Bible, in the book of Job. There's talk of dragons in Psalms, and in Jeremiah, he talks about turning Jerusalem into a den of dragons. They're in the Book of Mormon in 4 places, 2 quotes from Isaiah, and 2 in Mosiah and Alma. So they're all over in our culture. And they aren't standard. Even the depictions of them aren't standard. Sometimes they're scaly, wingless lizards. Sometimes they're feathery, 2-legged wyverns. Sometimes they're kind of look like armadillos in some manuscript depictions. And despite the fact that nobody's ever used any hard evidence of dragon existence or draconic existence, their stories keep multiplying about them, and depictions multiply. And they function both as a target for admiration and for fear. So one of the questions is, where does this come from? This idea of dragons, that's so universal. Did it start in one place? Some scholars, Smith in 1919 suggested that it started in ancient Egypt and just spread from there to the whole world. Just this idea of diffusion. Carl Sagan proposed that maybe it was a genetically encoded memory of dinosaurs that we've preserved over millions of years somewhere in our DNA that we just recognize this idea. David Jones suggests that dragons came into our minds, the minds of humans, as a combination of all the things we fear: the snake, the eagle, the panther, all predators of ancient primates, which triggers this fear response in us. I thought the most interesting maybe was Robert Blust, a linguist at the University of Hawaii, who argues that dragons are the end point of conceptual development which began with rainbows. And so the idea of rainbows and the affinity for water and the hoarding of treasure and shiny things and the fire breathing that dissipates water, all these things for him combine to make dragons a manifestation of rainbows, of rainbow serpents. And so he looks at Australian Aboriginal depictions of rainbow serpents going back 6,000 years, to some of the newest ones, and back as far as maybe 100,000 years of dragons. But as I said, the particular relationship of dragons to society is wildly different. So all these theories try to account for where dragons come from, but there's really no way to verify any of that. So let's look first at Europe. So medieval Europeans were raised on the lore of dragons, liturgical lore, poetic lore about dragons, great worms that could ravage the landscape, burn your villages, plunder your treasure. And these tales taught people to fear dragons for their physical size, their ability to inflict harm, and their greed for gold and wealth. If you think about it, these dragons, these early medieval dragons, actually in many ways resemble a caricature of the same feudal lords that dominated the lives of those peasants, those lords who devastated their villages and raped their women. You didn't need dragons, you had your own local masters. But it's interesting that although these stories of dragons go way back, they predate their first written versions often by centuries, it's really striking that most of the European stories of dragons are recorded after the Christianization of Europe. So think, Christianity spreads from the Middle East into Italy, into Europe, and by about 800 AD, you've got a pretty significant Christian base in Germany and England, and spreading into Scandinavia by about the year 1000. And so Icelandic sagas about dragons, Beowulf, a lot of these early tales are written down by Christian scribes. And so you wonder, what is it about the Christianization of Europe that makes dragons something that is suddenly worth writing down about? I mean, maybe they were there. There's a chronicle from medieval Europe that says, Odo was the bishop, and then there were dragons that ravaged the landscape this year, and then we had soup for lunch. It's just sort of a really mundane commentary that, yeah, so there were dragons. But what we see is, I think the dragons fill a function, that the people need dragons more in their cosmology than they needed them before, that they become these monstrous adversaries of God, man, and beast. And so you can focus a lot of your aggression on the dragons. And also, if you think about it, then because you have dragons, you need those same feudal lords that are exploiting you and killing your children, and the might of the Catholic Church to protect you from those dragons. So here's a quote from art historian Louise Lippincott that I think is really interesting. She says, in Revelation, Michael's conquest of the dragon ended the reign of Satan and cleared the way for the resurrection and creation of paradise on earth. To medieval interpreters of the Bible, Michael became the ideal type of the Christian soldier or crusader seeking to fulfill God's orders through military conquest. The dragon represented not only the devil, but also the infidel, the devil's earthly equivalent. Michael threw the dragon out of heaven, just as the crusaders wished to drive the infidel out of Jerusalem. The archetypal struggle between saint and dragon banished the beast to the outskirts of the Christian world. Medieval military and religious life consisted of a constant struggle to keep him there. And so what we see is that medieval Europe needed dragons to control and focus the church's fear of heresy and difference. And so if you feared the dragons and all the things dragons represented, then you could justify sending the entire flower of manhood of Europe to Jerusalem. And they did bring back soap and spices, which isn't all bad, I guess. Sorry, soap is good. But you see that it has an ideological function far beyond just a whimsical desire to believe in dragons. So, as I mentioned before, one of the earliest written accounts in European literature of an evil, treasure-hoarding, fire-breathing dragon is from Beowulf, which is the oldest extant poem in English. And it's probably written around 800 AD. The manuscript we have, the only manuscript of Beowulf, is about 200 years later. But I think that probably was copied repeatedly since about 800. And the hero of Beowulf is a Geat from southern Sweden. And so the question is always, like, why is the oldest English poem a heroic saga of Swedes and Geats fighting in Denmark? That's a story for another day, I guess. But it also reflects this interconnection in a world that we think of as far more isolated than it really was. So Beowulf is recruited to come to the court of Hrothgar in Denmark to fight Grendel, and then Grendel's mother. And Beowulf at this point is the prime of his life. He's this young, strapping guy who can swim 100 miles at full armor with 2 swords, which I would like to see anybody do today. And so he is the ideal dragon slayer. But when he meets a dragon, it's not in the prime of his life. It's after 50 years as the king of the Geats. He's defeated Grendel, his mother, he's ruled in peace, he's kept his kingdom safe. And then, when he's old and not quite decrepit, he still can wield a sword pretty effectively, but not the man who was, that's when a dragon awakens. And this dragon has been there a long time. The dragon had found a burial mound. So you think of those Scandinavian burial mounds that are filled with treasure to send a pagan lord into the next life. Somebody had created a burial mound and then the civilization died. And so they left this burial mound open, a dragon finds it, says this is, a nice, likely-looking hoard, and settles in. And he's fine, he's not a threat to anyone, until a desperate slave steals a gem-studded goblet from this lair. And then the translator, and I'm going to use Seamus Heaney's translation for this, and this is the next slide, he tells us what happens once this theft has been perpetrated, this violation against the dragon. The hoard guardian scorched the ground as he scoured and hunted for the trespasser who had troubled his sleep. The guardian of the mound, the hoard watcher, waited for the gloaming with fierce impatience. His pent-up fury at the loss of the vessel made him long to hit back and lash out in flames. Then, to his delight, the day waned, and he could wait no longer behind the wall, but hurtled forth in a fiery blaze. The first to suffer were the people of the land, but before long it was their treasurer who would come to grief. And I think it's really interesting, despite the fact this is written by a Christian scribe, I think you can't help but empathize with the dragon here. That he was minding his own business, tending to his own affairs, and someone came and violated his home. They stole his belongings, and naturally, he's upset. Naturally, he seeks revenge. But when he goes and he burns Beowulf's hall, then Beowulf himself is forced to seek revenge. And so he plots vengeance. And then you start to vilify the dragon. He's now attacked the humans. However justified that might be, they call him the vile sky winger, the sky plague, and they claim that he's seeking vengeance against the humans it loathes. So they still, though they revile the dragon, they attribute human emotions to this dragon and suggest that his nature is fundamentally different than humans. So Beowulf, straps on his armor, picks up his trusty sword, goes out to meet the dragon in the barrow, and their battle is fierce. This is where it gets surprising. He doesn't win. That you think Beowulf is the dragon slayer, dragon's bane. We'll talk about Sigurd in a minute. But the narrative tells us that fate denies him a glorious victory over the bane of that people. And you wonder, wait a minute, what kind of faith-affirming saga is this if the hero dies from draconic poison? His thane Wiglaf is able to kill the dragon and help Beowulf after his own sword shatters on the dragon's scales, but it costs Beowulf's own life. And they say how, although people are enriched, he's like, well, I gave my last breath for this treasure, which is nice, so they've all got a tax break that year. But they're the lesser for his loss, that he was this great warrior. When you think about it, they also mention how the end of his days was nigh, that he had come to the end of his days anyway. So why would Beowulf need a dragon? Well, think of a culture where dying in bed is a shame. That you don't want to die peacefully. You need to die in a blaze of glory. So how convenient. You produce a dragon to give you that blaze of glory, to give him the valor of a hero's death, rather than the shame of a comfortable passing. Next slide, please. So we see other depictions like this, as I mentioned before, in the story of Sigurd, the dragon slayer. So this comes from the Old Norse Völsungasaga, which is the Fornaldarsaga. It's a story of the past, of the Icelandic people, with their Viking traditions and their the Norwegian connections. It's also found in the Middle High German Nibelungenlied. So Wagner draws on both of those for his Ring of the Nibelungen. And the stories are slightly different. There's differences in names and differences in details, but they both agree. The gist of the story is an ambitious young prince named Sigurd, or Sigurður, seeks out the dragon Fafnir in order to kill him and steal his treasures, which is kind of the heroic story, right? Bored young man picks up a lance, goes to murder innocent people, or creatures. And they don't have to justify why he seeks out the dragon. The fact that he is a dragon is enough to justify killing him. He's a valid target for aggression. But then we learn that Fafnir has not always been a dragon. In fact, Fafnir was a man. Fafnir had a father and two brothers, and his brother was killed by the god Loki. And when Loki killed his brother Ottar, his father demanded that they fill his skin, Ottar could shapeshift, he looked like an otter, fill his otter skin full of gold as a compensation, a weregild, if you will, the price of his life for the family. And so Loki gives him the gold, but being Loki, he curses it. And so they get the gold back. Fafnir wants the gold, so he kills his father, steals the gold, and turns himself into a dragon to guard this. But that really complicates the story. It's not just any old dragon. This is a man in dragon shape that Sigurd is targeting, and he's been put onto this by Fafnir's brother, Regin, the smith, which makes you think, wait a minute, this isn't a story about dragons at all. This is family feud. This is a brother who wants the same treasure his brother has stolen. So Sigurd attacks Fafnir. He's got all kinds of help, and he's successful. He's able to kill him. The battle is not particularly prolonged. And as a result, Sigurd gains supernatural abilities. But he also gains a share in the curse. That he eats the dragon's heart, which he's roasting for Regin. He just happens to lick his finger, so you should always apparently lick your finger and taste while you're cooking. And discovers that he can understand the speech of birds. And understanding the speech of birds lets him realize that Regin is planning to kill him to cover up this crime. And so naturally, he kills Regin instead, and bathes in the dragon's blood, which Odin has told him will make him invulnerable. And so he is invulnerable except for a spot between his shoulder blades. You know that part you can never quite reach in the bath? You can't quite get that spot. So there's got one spot that makes him invulnerable. And so later he has this sense of his own value and prestige from having killed Fafnir, but then he is stabbed between those shoulder blades as a result of having partaken of this treasure. And so you see that there is a consequence for unprovoked slaughter, even of a dragon. And we realize the story is much more about human greed and jealousy and treachery than any actual dragon and the danger it might pose. But let's stop here for a minute. This is the tradition of the European dragon. And we think, well, maybe that's just natural. You know, big flying beasts that can breathe fire is something we should always be afraid of, instinctually. Because that fear response that David Evans talks about. But if you look at the Asian tradition, this is not the way that people have looked at dragons. Fear and resentment is not the natural response to dragons in those traditions. Instead, those dragons are wise sages and divine beings who are admired, respected for their beauty and their wisdom. And so if you think about Blunt's theory, the rainbow serpent, Asian dragons tend to be associated with water and are often sort of serpentine creatures, large, wingless, clawed feet that live in water. Next slide, please. If you look at the stories about dragons in Japan and Korea and China, elsewhere in Asia, they don't foreground the threat dragons pose to humans. They foreground their wisdom, the advice they can give, the help they can lend, and their close connections to the human realm. It's not that people have to choose, like Fafnir, to be either a man or a dragon. In Chinese and Japanese mythology, people flaunt their descendants from dragons. The 7th century mythohistory Kojiki in Japan describes the sovereign of heaven as a dragon capable of changing into human form. And the dragon god Ryujin rules the seas and the ocean. And his daughter, Toyotama Hime, the luminous pearl princess, is credited as the ancestress of Japan's first emperor, Emperor Jimmu. So in the European tradition, rulers want to go back to the gods. They want to go back to Odin and Thor. My husband's genealogy has both Odin, Thor, and Niall the Nine Hostages from Irish folklore. So we're all kind of connected, apparently. But in Asian mythology, you want it to be descended from dragons. That you want it to be invested with that kind of wisdom, that kind of strength. And the dragons are a traditional symbol for Chinese emperors because of their control over water and the weather. But they're also just generally a symbol for power, strength, and good luck. I'm not sure that Beowulf's dragon or Fafnir would consider themselves particularly lucky, but I guess maybe there are rabbits, right? That, to get their feed, they pay a price. So if you look at the 16th century Chinese novel, The Journey to the West by Wu Cheng'en, the dragon god plays this really prominent role in dispensing justice, controlling the elements, and rectifying wrongs. He's a figure of wisdom and admiration. And this depiction of dragons as benevolent gods and this claim of familial connections necessarily means that people have a different relationship to dragons. If you think a dragon might be your great-grandmother, you're not going to go killing them first chance you get. You'll bring offerings, and you'll bring respect, and you'll ask for advice and wisdom. And so you learn how to venerate dragons in a completely different way. So I just want to share one brief story that I think is just so beautiful at illustrating this. It's from Pu Songling's 16th century Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio. And Pu Songling is a failed scholar who just writes these really quirky little tales. And one of these tales is called Dragon Dormant in the translation. And it tells of his official. You have the commissioner here who's working at his desk late one night, and suddenly he sees a little form wiggling across his papers. It says, meandering across his scroll, scorching the paper as it went. And so he's sitting there watching this wiggling thing, scorching his paper, and he thinks, oh, that's a dragon. And unlike my children who start screaming at spiders, he doesn't panic, he doesn't get alarmed, he just thinks, oh, well, I should take it outside. So he picks up his scroll, he goes outside, he holds it up for the dragon to fly away, and the dragon won't. It curls up in on itself and refuses to budge. And so he thinks, well, what am I doing wrong? He goes back and thinks, of course. He goes back to put on his Mandarin robes and his Mandarin hat, comes to the dragon and bows deeply. And then he picks up the dragon again and carries it outside. And this time, the dragon is willing to go. So it's just a matter of proper respect, that you can't just toss him out in the night. You have to acknowledge his dragonness. And so then the dragon is released, and then it grows from this little caterpillar-like lizard into a giant serpent. Its head now the size of a large earthenware jar, its huge trunk 20 or 30 hands in circumference. And it flies away, soaring up into the heavens. And that's the whole story. But I think it's this beautiful story that recognizes that you don't have to fear dragons, you don't have to loathe them and kill them. And so, looking now to more contemporary literature, we see that the European tradition of fear and hostility towards dragons has gradually changed in our literary tradition. There's a long, so there's sort of a gap. We have these early pieces, and you have some sort of early modern depictions of dragons in The Fairy Queen by Spencer and some other places. But it's really not until the mid-19th century you start to get a couple more dragons, and then just an explosion of dragons in the 20th century. And this new explosion of dragon literature is a much more empathetic style of writing about dragons, which I think sort of juxtaposes this Asian respect with the recognition of Enlightenment thinking that we don't necessarily, we can't necessarily judge the humanity or the worth of another creature. And so we start to see the dragons being more and more human-like. And there's an interesting pairing that kind of illustrates this divide or this developing change in dragon literature. If you look at J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who are friends and colleagues in Oxford, they both write books that feature dragons. And the first one we'll talk about is Tolkien's Hobbit, 1937. And Tolkien was a scholar of Old Norse. He knew the stories of Fafnir, he knew Volsunga Saga, and it's not at all surprising that his Smaug draws heavily on those models, that he's that kind of malevolent, treasure-hoarding, evil dragon. And so next slide please, when Bilbo sneaks into the Lonely Mountain, he finds Smaug asleep, a vast red golden dragon, a dire menace, even in his sleep. And the dragon is dreaming, but we're told he's dreaming of greed and violence, because that's just who he is, it's the kind of dragon he is. So Bilbo, like the thief in Beowulf, steals a cup from the dragon, and just like with the dragon in Beowulf, next slide please, this causes the dragon justifiably to become angry. And he tells us that Smaug's rage passes description, the sort of rage that is only seen when rich folk that have more than they can enjoy suddenly lose something that they have long had but have never before used or wanted. His fire belched forth, the hall smoked, he shook the mountain roots. To hunt the whole mountain till he had caught the thief and had torn and trampled him was his one thought. He issued from the gate, the waters rose in fierce whistling steam, and up he soared, blazing into the air, and settled on the mountaintop in a spout of green and scarlet flame. And so we do have this kind of traditional depiction of dragons, but we also have this very interesting commentary about the kind of person the dragon would be if he were a person. The kind of person who's like, oh, was that my 17th Maserati that you just stuffed? I think you should forfeit your house. And this sort of income inequality and class hierarchy is much more explicit in Tolkien than it ever would have been in Volsunga Saga. And unlike Fafnir and Beowulf's dragon, Smaug possesses many human qualities. He can reason, he can communicate, he can think, he can speak and laugh and riddle with Bilbo. So Bilbo treats him like he would a petulant aristocrat, right? He flatters him and calls him, "Oh, Smaug, the chiefest and greatest of calamities." But even then, even with his dragon lore, honed, Bilbo still only narrowly resists falling under his spell. And so I think this testifies to that strange phenomenon that we see of people who very often admire the same things that oppress them, who admire the things that cause them grief. But Bilbo learns a life lesson from this. So the dragon takes off and ravages Esgaroth, and Bard is able to bring him down with a black arrow, and that's saves the day, ruins the town. But Bilbo's lesson he takes away is never laugh at live dragons. So you may need to fear them, you may need to fight them, but don't underestimate them and don't laugh at them. And so this dragon is physically dangerous as the earlier European ones, but it's far more devious, far more human-like in its subtlety and manipulation. Next slide. So 2 decades later, C.S. Lewis decides to write his dragon story, and he publishes The Voyage of the Dawn Treader in 1958. And it's the 5th novel in the Narnia series, and this time we see dragons quite explicitly as the mirror of humans, and as being a focus of the story. So I don't remember The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, but it's Lucy and Edmund Pevensey are spending the summer at their aunt and uncle's home while their parents are touring America with Susan, the beautiful, and Peter's studying for exams. And so they are home, and their cousin Eustace is tormenting them. Eustace, who doesn't appreciate their stories of Narnia, who mocks them, and they're in Lucy's room watching a picture of a dragon-proud ship on the waves. And Eustace is mocking them as usual and teasing them, and the picture comes to life. And the waves get bigger, and they can feel the spray in their face, and suddenly they're on the Dawn Treader, back in Narnia, riding the Caspian to the ends of the earth. Fair enough, and Eustace is a brat. He complains the whole time, wants to the British embassy, wants to call his parents, how can there be no conveniences here, why don't you just travel by airplane? This is all ridiculous to him, and he has no sympathy for their quest. Then they put him on an island, and everyone's making camp and getting ready to work, and Eustace sneaks off. He doesn't want to do any work, he doesn't want to help out. And he goes to the heart of the island, and he comes across a dragon that has crawled out of its cave to die by a lake. And then it starts to rain, and Eustace goes into the dragon's lair and finds all this treasure. And we're told that Eustace hadn't been a particularly greedy child, but he sees all this treasure and starts thinking, this will make me powerful. This will make me special. This will make me great. And so he starts gathering the wealth in his pockets full of diamonds. He slides an armband up his arm. Then he falls asleep. And I find this is a very bad decision. Because, as the narrator tells us, sleeping on a dragon's hoard with greedy, dragonish thoughts in his heart, Eustace had become a dragon himself. So he wakes up and his arm is throbbing because that bracelet is now much too small for dragon limbs. It's a great scene where he waves his arm, he sees a dragon's claw, and thinks, oh no, there's a dragon next to me. So he rolls over, waves his other arm, there's 2 dragons next to me. And then it takes him until he gets out to the lake, and he looks in the mirror of the lake, and he sees himself and realizes that he is a dragon. And this is a delightful narrative move by Lewis, because it forces us to look through the dragon's eyes. It forces us to look in the mirror and see ourselves as a dragon and think, in what way am I dragonish? So the dragon still isn't completely positive, but Eustace has to look at himself and see how he is this dragon in the mirror. And he experiences 2 epiphanies. Next slide, please. His first feeling was one of relief. There was nothing to be afraid of anymore. He was a terror himself now, nothing in the world but a knight, and not all of those would dare to attack him. He could even get even with Caspian and Edmund now. So his first thought is this sort of like, well, if dragons are monsters, I'm going to be a monster. I can go ravage and wreak havoc and get vengeance. But then because we are inside of Edmund, we know that Eustace, we know that he is more than that. His second realization is the moment he thought this, he realized he didn't want to. He wanted to be friends. He wanted to get back among humans and talk and laugh and share things. He realized that he was a monster cut off from the whole human race. An appalling loneliness came over him. And so what we get is this turn. We recognize maybe none of the monsters are really monsters. None of the monsters want to be monsters. Maybe all the monsters just want to laugh and share and have friends and be part of a society. And so Eustace dares to fly down to the beach knowing that they may kill him. And he's ashamed of himself, ashamed of his appearance, the bat-like wings, the saw-edged ridge on his back, the cruel curved claws. And he's really ashamed that he likes raw meat. He always hides off to go eat because he doesn't want people to see him tearing into raw meat. But he goes down, he seeks out human companionship. And Lucy is the one who recognizes him. They start thinking, oh, how can we kill this dragon? And she says, oh, look, he's hurt. Look at his throbbing paw, his throbbing leg with that bracelet. Maybe he needs help. And so she goes into the dragon, is able to communicate with him. He can't talk, but he clearly can understand. And so she's like, are you an enchanted person? Which wouldn't necessarily be my first thought, encountering a dragon. But Lucy's been trained in this. She's learned from Aslan to see beyond appearances. And so she says, are you this Narnian lord we're searching for? And he says, no. And she's like, well, are you Eustace? Who happens to be missing? He's like, yes. And so he spends his time as a dragon, and he learns to be a better person. And this is the real transformation. Turning to a dragon is just incidental. It's turning into a human that makes Eustace redeemable. That he learns to be kind, to be helpful, to reach out, to value his friends, to value their friendship. And it's only after he's transformed inside that he dreams of Aslan. And Aslan takes him to a pool and asks him to take off his skin. And he takes off his skin and again and again and again. And he can't do it until Aslan comes and rips off this dragon skin, which is the thick, unwieldy armor that he's been wearing. And then he is able to emerge as a true human. And so he's reborn from his dragon skin into humanity. And he rejects both the treasure of the cave and the curse of being a dragon that had poisoned Fafnir and Sigurd's lives. So that brings us more or less to the present wave of dragon literature. And as I said, I can't possibly enumerate all of it. I brought a couple of my favorites here. Naomi Noakes Hemmer will talk about that. Ursula Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea. I don't know if you've read this one, Jasper Ford's The Last Dragon Slayer, which is whimsical and delightful. I'm not going to talk about Robin Hobb and the Rainbow Chronicles, which is another fantastic exploration of dragons. But I'll talk about a few of the highlights of examples of this paradigm shift in the way we look at dragons. And we use them as direct or indirect reflections of human types. Next slide, please. So the first one is Le Guin, because the course of her Earthsea books really tracks this transformation. In the first two books of the series, which starts in 1964, dragons are greedy and cruel. Yvonne is much like Smaug, and so you don't feel Smaug, so you don't feel much empathy for them. But as the series progresses, the dragons change. They become more civilized and more powerful, virtual demigods who speak the language of creation as their mother tongue. And we start to like the dragons, to want to be like the dragons. But by the time The Other Wind, the sixth and final novel in the series, appeared in 2001, the depictions of dragons in Earthsea had reached the opposite extreme from where it started. So this last story, well, there's more stories, but this last novel, the dragon Orm, which is the word for worm, which is the traditional word for dragon, he takes human form to address the king and the council to seek their help in addressing the balance between humans who have chosen to pursue power and rebirth, and the dragons who chose immortality and freedom. But as humans often do, they reneged. The dragons got the west, the humans got the east, and then the humans came and took part of the west as a place for their dead to rest as an afterlife. But it doesn't work, because they stole it from the dragons, and the dead are trapped behind a wall. Walls don't work terribly well, apparently, for keeping things out or in. And so the dead are trapped, and they're tearing down the wall. So the dragons and the humans together go to tear down this wall and resolve this conflict and restore the balance. And in the process, one of the main characters, a young woman named Tehanu, who's the focus of the previous book, discovers that she is in fact a dragon, that she was born a dragon and has been masquerading as a human her whole life, and now is able to reconcile herself with her own identity and become a dragon. And this bond, between the genetic and emotional bond between the races, I think is one of the most remarkable things about this conclusion, is that we are more alike than we think. We are more connected than we think, and we can't get along without each other. Next slide, please. I also want to look at Robin McKinley, because she also has an interesting shift in her dragon lore. If you look at The Hero and the Crown, which was published in 1984, and Dragonhaven, which was published in 2007, you see a similar pairing of dragons to be feared and dragons to be protected. So in Hero and the Crown, Maud, the malevolent telepathic dragon, is a thoroughly evil creature. His very bones spread depression and despair. After Erenthal, the protagonist, has killed him, they bring his skull back to the city and hang it up, and the whole country is swept by gloom and depression, and everything goes wrong. Erenthal is this unlikely protagonist. She starts out as a too tall, too redheaded misfit, the wrong kind of princess. And so she starts training an old warhorse, learns how to devise an ointment, protect herself from dragon fire, and goes out to fight dragons. But the dragons she fights are vermin. They're small, rat-like, rodent-like, dog-like dragons. But she persists and slays these dragons and learns her craft. Despite the public and private approval, her father, her best friend, and the whole court mock her for this endeavor. But in some way, she prefigures Robert Monk's princess in The Paper Bag Princess, if anyone's read that, which is one of my also favorite dragon stories. That there's no point in being a useless princess. You'd be a useful princess that takes charge of your own destiny. But the point of the story still is that Eren defeats Maud and breaks his hold on the hearts and minds of her countrymen. And so but it's less a triumphant dragon slaying like St. George or St. Michael, as an act of self-sacrifice and rebirth, because in killing Maud, she almost dies herself. She sacrifices her own future, her own chance to be a princess, to live in luxury and in human comfort to prevent his influence. And his influence, far more than the fire, which she has learned to protect herself from, is whispering self-doubt. That sort of nagging fear that you're not good enough, that you'll never be good enough. And that's, I think, a very human kind of poison. But almost a quarter century later, in Dragonhaven, McKinley has discovered an entirely new paradigm of dragons. These dragons are victims of human aggression. They've been discovered in Australia and hunted almost to extermination. And so one brave soul establishes a reserve for dragons in California. I think it's like Wyoming, sort of vaguely western United States. Maybe it's here. You can find it. And most people have never seen these dragons, but people come and they look and they dream, but they also tremble. And so the government reaches a compromise, as governments sometimes do, that they will protect the dragons and allow this reserve to endure, but they make it a felony to aid dragons. If you help save a dragon's life, that is as bad as murdering the president. It's treason. And so the people in the reserve have this strange mandate to protect the dragons without helping the dragons in any way. And so the main character, Jack, goes on an overnight camp out in the park, and he discovers a dead mother, or dying mother dragon, with her dragon babies strewn on the ground, 6 of them, and a dead poacher. The poacher had come to attack her, and she defended herself against this man who was going to kill her and her babies, and in the process is killed. But Jack comes in, and one of the babies is alive. And he faces this dilemma, because he's not allowed to save the babies. He's not allowed to help the dragons. But he is a human being who's been raised by good people, and he picks up the dragon, sticks it in his shirt, and becomes its mother. Which causes all kinds of trouble because A, it's scorching hot and gives him all kinds of burns on his body. B, it's growing really fast. And C, he's become a criminal. And so Jake violates the law, but what he accomplishes through this and the rallying around him of his community is a breakthrough in human-dragon communication, in coexistence and cooperation. And they realized that the laws were stupid in the first place, that nobody appreciated who the dragons really were, that they're wise and they're peaceful and they are sentient and they can communicate through telepathic language. And as a result of Jake's courage and his family's support and his colleagues' support, they are able to learn dragon speech, establish new protections for dragons, revitalize their park, that they are protecting the dragons, and at the end he's chosen to stand in as a sort of quasi-godfather for one of the new dragons that's born. And this experience provides him with the opportunity of flying together with an entire troop of dragons, which produces this quote, which I thought was enormously appropriate for today. He raves, "Let me tell you, flying in a troop of dragons is more amazing than anything. Life, the universe, everything." So in saving the dragons, Jake finds his own destiny and humanity's destiny. Okay, next slide. So I can't not talk about Anne McCaffrey, as I said. She was the origin of my love of dragons, and I think she's also one of the major architects of this shift in dragon lore. The publication of Dragonflight in 1968, she introduced an entirely new type of dragon, an intelligent, civic-minded, telepathic, time-traveling dragon that bonds emotionally with a single rider for life. And these dragons are not naturally occurring dragons, which I think is also important. They are genetically engineered from a naturally occurring life form on a newly colonized planet. Parallel Earth resources negligible. Pern. And so Pern has little to offer besides arable land for agriculture, but it has these cute little fire lizards. And it isn't until the red star passes close enough to drop spores that eat through anything organic except for rock, dirt, and water that they discover that they need these fire lizards more than they knew, that all of their technology and all of their intellectual mastery is nothing in the face of this danger. And so they breed the fire lizards into the size of dragons to protect themselves from this organism. And in the process, they discover that the only way the dragons can function is by bonding emotionally and psychologically to a human rider, which creates a really interesting avenue for social mobility in a pre-technological society. But everybody else is replicating sort of a feudal earth structure when you have landowners and you have laborers, but dragon riders are a breed apart, quite literally apart. They have to go live in caverns and caves and far from everybody, and they have privileges. They can fly, they can move, they can travel in ways that no one else can. And so they're set apart, which both makes them objects of admiration and envy. And so what McCaffrey does, I think, is so brilliant, next slide please, is that she creates this world where you see both sides. Where you see people who fear dragons for their size, who fear them for their ability to breathe fire, who hate them and resent them for the privileges that they and their riders get, but who need them to survive. They cannot survive without the dragons. And the dragons we know are sworn never to hurt human beings. They're created by humans. They like humans. They bond with humans. They pose no threat, except at hatching when they're too young to know better. But but people still fear them. And so in her first book in the series, Dragonflight, we find a protagonist, Lessa, who exemplifies the kind of person that can balance those two things. It can balance the fear of dragons and the need for dragons. Someone with a strong mind and will, who can be a partner equal to a dragon. So Lessa of Ruatha is the daughter of a noble family, a feudal family, if you will, and her family is slaughtered by a rival claimant. Fax comes in and tears down her family's hold, murders her family. She survives as a servant. So it's kind of, in many ways, a much more violent Cinderella story. But her plan is to wreak vengeance. Her plan is to conquer back her family's land, but then she's found on search. By the strength of her mind, she'll be able to control dragons, and so that sort of tags her as a good candidate for the only queen dragon on Pern. They've gone through this period of decline. They have no dragons, one queen egg, and she is hardened by her years of deprivation and sharpened by her desire for vengeance, which makes her strong enough to ride this dragon. But it's the dragon herself who makes Lessa soft enough to be the dragon rider she needs to be. But I want to look really briefly at the scene of Rabbit's impression, because it's such a stark contrast to these European scenes early European scenes of conquering dragons and fearing dragons. Next slide, please. It's a communal celebration, and it really celebrates this emotional bond. Lessa was aware of a loud hum within the hall. Glancing up at the audience, she realized it emanated from the watching bronze dragons, for this was the birth of their mate, their queen. The hum increased in volume as the shell shattered into fragments, and the golden, glistening body of the new female emerged. As the golden beast, crying piteously, lurched down from the raised arena toward the scattered women, Lessa moved. Lessa swung the head around so the many faceted eyes were forced to look at her, and found herself lost in that rainbow regard. A feeling of joy suffused Lessa, a feeling of warmth, tenderness, and unalloyed affection and instant respect and admiration flooded her mind and heart and soul. Never again would Lessa lack an advocate, a defender, an intimate, aware instantly of the temper of her mind and heart, her desires. Becoming Rabbit's rider changes Lessa's life permanently, from the place she lives to her choice of sexual partner, but it gives her the chance to save her world, which has become, as I said, contemptuous of dragons' outside appetites and disdainful of their ability, this long interval between the passes. But when she discovers the dragon's ability to travel through time, Lessa doesn't hesitate. She immediately leaps back 400 years in time to bring back new dragon riders, or old dragon riders as it were, to fight this menace. And so you see that by bonding with the dragon, she becomes more human, a better human, and saves humanity. Okay, next slide. And so finally, it's about a time, but I want to just look briefly at Naomi Novik's Temeraire series, which is set during the Napoleonic Wars, and an alternate Earth that employs dragons in war. So it's Master Commander, sort of with dragons. And it goes much farther toward advancing the view of dragons as fundamentally identical to humans in all but physical form. Maybe not identical, maybe better than humans. And this perception of dragons as animals that we've seen through time, but which McKinley challenges so effectively in Dragonhaven, is further destabilized here by draconic protagonists who are at least as prominent, at least as intelligent, and compassionate as their human partners. In Novik's literary world, dragons exist in all nations of the world in different sizes and colors, with varying abilities, much like humans themselves, vary in skin tone and talents. So when the British naval officer William Lawrence captures a dragon egg that hatches aboard his ship, he's forced to harness it and surrender his naval career for the life of an aviator. And this elicits pity for everyone he knows, to have to be harnessed to a beast, to have to live in squalor, changed to an animal for the rest of his life. And he has believed this, he's been raised on this. Much like Candide and his belief in Panglossian optimism, this is the world he knows. It's the best of all possible worlds, the only possible way to treat dragons. But the longer he associates with Temeraire, and he discovers that dragons are not just organic machines fit for flying into battle and aiming at the enemy. They are complex, compassionate, intelligent creatures, and everything he knew about dragons was wrong. Last slide, please. Temeraire is possessed of a lively mind and inquisitive temperament. He learns languages with no effort at all. He masters mathematics and physics easily, but demonstrates a remarkable capacity for both empathy and leadership. He's willing to fight on the British side during the Napoleonic Wars, but he wants to be treated like a sentient being, not chained up like a beast. And so he's not been raised to believe that he is lesser. And he, in some ways, I think represents the common British soldier who had little choice but to fight for his country, the country in which he was born, but was given little compensation besides the necessities of life. But Temeraire has the strength and the ability to show that this kind of treatment is not acceptable. Their partnership lasts over 8 books, and they travel to every continent on the globe, and they discovered that there are many, many ways, many possible worlds and ways of being with dragons. There are draconic societies that flourish without human intervention, or with humans as sort of slaves and servants, like in Peru. That the fear of dragons that motivates people to hobble their dragons with chains, like in Russia, is degrading to both man and dragon. While societies that treat dragons with respect, China, and then eventually Napoleon and France, treat them on a par with their human counterparts, are far more stable and balanced and successful. And so we find that Britain is losing the war because they treat dragons like animals. And as they learn to treat dragons as the beings they are, then Britain is able to succeed in the war. And so throughout the series, the need for humane treatment of dragons, and befitting both their intellect and their self-awareness, and the recognition of their agency, drives home the point, to me at least, that although humans have long considered dragons to be animals, our barbaric treatment of animals that turns the mirror on us. So thanks very much.